Good morning. Our next speaker has been a member of MUFON since almost its beginning. He comes to us from the Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary in Berkeley, California, where he teaches systematic theology. He has recently served as a consultant for NASA and SETI on the ethics of planetary protection. He is a published author of the book UFOs, God's Chariots. Here to speak about will extraterrestrial contact put an end to world religions, Dr. Ted Peters.
It's noisy, isn't it? Yeah, it's certainly a pleasure for me to be here, as John suggested. MUFON has been something I'm interested in, and for a long time I served as the Louisiana State Director for a period, and I delivered an address sort of like this in 1979, although you'll hear that a lot of my research is a little bit more recent. When I was a kid growing up in Dearborn, Michigan, my mom and dad were getting really interested in this new thing, flying saucers, and they would go to hear lectures from Donald Kehoe and George Adamski, and I would sit on the living room floor and just get excited by all of this. And you know what? The excitement has not gone away. My particular topic is, will ETI contact put an end to our world's religions, or a little bit more modestly, will it precipitate a crisis in the world's religions? Here, I have to make my clicker work. Oh, wrong clicker maybe. Here we are. I'm going to take an empirical approach and begin with a hypothesis. And the hypothesis is this: official confirmation of the discovery of a civilization of intelligent beings living on another planet would so undercut traditional religious beliefs that Earth's religious traditions would face a crisis. So that's the hypothesis. And to test that, we need to, first I need to say why it is that I want to ask this question. The reason is that it seems to be widely accepted, both in scientific circles and in popular circles, that somehow either UFOs or contact with ET would have a shattering impact. Here I cite Paul Davies, the physicist and cosmologist who's now working in the area of astrobiology at Arizona State University. He writes, the existence of extraterrestrial intelligences would have a profound impact on religion, shattering completely the traditional perspective on God's relationship with man. And Paul and I have debated this issue. I think I should win the debate, but right now I'd like to pose the question, is Paul right? Is what he says true or not? And now I'll say, let's look at evidence that could be pertinent. And I'd like to share with you this morning three kinds of evidence. First is the results of a survey, the Peters ETI Religious Crisis Survey. Secondly, what have theologians actually said on this particular topic? And then thirdly, if we can distinguish between being spiritual and being religious, maybe we can get at the very subtle relationship in which science in our particular culture takes on and absorbs and expresses our religious sensibilities. So we'll take a look at these three kinds of evidence and asking just what might be the impact on religion if we meet them. Well, if we ask a theologian, we might as well go to probably the greatest theologian in the history of Christianity, St. Thomas Aquinas. And St. Thomas asked, would God create other worlds with intelligent creatures? Now, his answer was no. He said, it is necessary that all things should belong to one world. This answer is really his interpretation of Aristotle, who had confronted the same question. And Aristotle thought that perfection had to do with oneness, and what St. Thomas wanted to reject here was pluralism or plurality. Okay, so St. Thomas rejects the idea of extraterrestrial intelligent beings, but what's so important it is, here we are in the 12th century, he's asking the question. Only a generation later, another theologian, John Buridan, asked the same question, and he comes up with a different answer. We hold from faith, note that it's faith, not science, we hold from faith that just as God made this world, so he could make another or several worlds. So what's fascinating is that 800 years ago, the issue was being raised, and theologians could say either yay or nay about it. All right, let's ask about today's Roman Catholics. I'm going to speak here initially out of the survey that I conducted a couple of years ago. And I want to say it was a pleasure for me yesterday to meet Victoria Alexander. She had actually conducted a similar survey on a smaller scale a few years ago, and I was somewhat inspired by that. So this particular survey builds on that, and the findings are really quite similar. So let's pose the question, if you're a Roman Catholic today, how might you and your other Catholic friends be thinking about this particular question? Here's one of the questions. Official confirmation of the discovery of a civilization of intelligent beings living on another planet would so undercut my beliefs that my beliefs would face a crisis. Well, take a look at the proportion. You've got 58% and 24% in the agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. Only 8% of Roman Catholics would say, yes, my faith would face a crisis. The next question is changed just slightly from my faith to the faith of my religious tradition. Official confirmation of the discovery of a civilization of intelligent beings living on another planet would so undercut the beliefs of my particular religious tradition, my Roman Catholicism, that Catholicism would face a crisis. Now look, we still have a strong majority, 66% are saying, no, my tradition's faith is not going to confront a crisis. There is still a small but slightly different agree and strongly agree. Now we're up to 22%. So what this could mean is that if you're a Roman Catholic, you might say, well, my faith personally will not confront a crisis, but I'm a little bit worried about the people I go to church with, or maybe those rigid priests, or who knows what the Pope is going to think. So there's a slight shift there, and I just want to flag it because we're going to see this consistently in different believing groups. The survey allowed people to just add comments if they wanted to, and some of the comments were the richest and most interesting part of the survey. One Catholic writes, "The world is too vast and wonderful, and God's power so limitless that there must be more than little old us." That's the kind of Copernican question, you know, that some people want to say, before Copernicus we lived in a very small world. After Copernicus we had to live in a larger world. And now that we have awareness of the possibility of sharing our cosmic neighborhood, to use Stan Friedman's language, are we going to be ready to share our neighborhood with other sentient beings And this pops up again and again in the survey. Another Catholic writes, "My religious viewpoints and practices would remain unchanged. The same God who made me is also capable of making extraterrestrials." Well, what about today's Roman Catholic theologians? Hans Küng, very liberal, if you're a Roman Catholic, liberal theologian, says we must allow for living beings intelligent, although quite different living beings, also on other stars of the universe. What about the Pope? Well, the fact that the Vatican has had an observatory for 4 centuries ought to tell you something. Here's a picture of George Coyne, the Jesuit, longtime director. For 4 decades, he's been searching for extraterrestrial life among other agendas of the Vatican Observatory. And what I find flabbergasting is that journalists will discover this about the Vatican and then pretend it's a shock. But it's been routine for a long time, and so if either the Vatican Observatory or the Pope is not going to be worried about it, I'm not sure I need to be worried about it. What about mainline Protestants? The sample was large enough. Here on question 3, would ET precipitate a crisis in my faith? We see almost the same thing we saw with the Roman Catholics. Strong disagreement. Only a tiny fraction, 3%, of mainline Protestants think that they themselves would hit a faith crisis. Then when we move to not my beliefs but those of my denomination, we get the same pattern we saw with the Catholics, just a slightly large worry or anxiety that my fellow believers will have a problem even though I don't. Here are some of the comments from the Protestants. Finding ETI, I believe, would be a profound and wonderful event. And the next one is my all-time favorite. Hey, I'd share a pew with an extraterrestrial any day. Here's a thoughtful analytical comment. A crisis in a tradition does not lead to its dissolution, so this person's looking forward to the crisis, but usually to its eventual strengthening. So this person is anticipating a crisis, but then a sense of renewal. What about Protestant theologians? For the most part, Protestant theologians don't talk about this topic, but when they do, they're generally affirmative. Here's Paul Tillich, one of the dominant theologians of the last century, writing in his 3-volume Systematic Theology, in light of the immensity of the universe, the heliocentric system of planets, the infinitely small part of the universe which man and his history constitute, our basic answer leaves the universe open for possible divine manifestations in other areas or periods of being, and he means divine manifestations to intelligent beings. Barry Downing is a longtime MUFON supporter, Presbyterian pastor with a doctorate in physics, wrote the book The Bible and Flying Saucers in 1970, an advocate of the ancient alien interpretation of ancient scriptures. Now let's turn to the evangelical Protestants, and here I did not distinguish between the fundamentalists and the evangelicals in general. I would hope that another survey would actually try to refine it a little bit. Here with question 3, we see exactly the same thing as we saw with the Catholics and the main lines. Overwhelming disagree. Evangelicals do not feel that their faith is going to be threatened. Then when we turn to what about my fellow evangelicals, again, just a slight increase so that contact with ET will be okay for me, but I'm a little bit worried about the person next to me in the pew. The comments, as you can expect, evangelicals are more likely to reference Scripture as their center of gravity. And what's going to happen there? Well, one writes, I think the Bible leaves room for other creatures in the universe, both physical and spiritual. If we meet them, then they will probably have a relationship with God as well, although their story may sound different to us. Or, I believe in a God so big that if he desired, he could have created other intelligence within the universe. That's that Copernican expansion notion again. I don't think they're out there, but if they are, hey, that's cool. Well, as you probably heard, there are some, usually in the evangelical or fundamentalist camp, that see UFOs as demonic, that see belief in ETI as demonic. And if you go to the websites, you'll see the battle of the blogs on this particular topic. The survey did pick up a few people who think in this fashion, but what was surprising was it was very small on the survey. It is a loud and interesting battle, to be sure, but I suspect that it represents a fractional point of view and certainly not a dominant point of view. If we ask theologically, why is it that someone might want to think that ETI or UFOs are satanic, I see two answers. One is UFOs are not in the Bible. Another one, which is very convoluted, but if you look carefully, you'll spot it, and that is, if you and I see a UFO, we're tended to believe in the theory of evolution. You might say, well, wait a minute, what's that connection? Well, we'll get to that in a little bit when I talk about the ETI myth, but people who hold this position, and I've talked to them, tried to understand them, I'm not holding that position, really feel that UFOs are a temptation. Billy Graham, probably the single most respected spokesperson for American evangelicalism, represents, I think, what is the dominant view. I firmly believe there are intelligent beings like us, far away in space, and to add, who worship God. Buddhism. Our Buddhism sample was large enough, and the Buddhism result I find just fascinating. Look at this. On the question about my beliefs, nobody disagrees. What about those of my fellow Buddhists? We get virtually 100% thinking that there's nothing inherent about Buddhism that would run into a conflict with ET contact. And then we get a comment from one of the Buddhists, which is the Copernican comment again, to think that in the infinity of the universe that we are the only intelligent life form in existence is ludicrous. I would only hope those beings would exhibit more wisdom than humans have in how they relate to their world and fellow beings. So this is an opportunity to offer a little indictment to the human condition here on earth. What about Mormons? Mormons curiously have extraterrestrial intelligence already in their theology, so no problem there. There were not enough Jews to give me confidence in our sample, so I called my friend, Rabbi Chaim Perlmutter in Chicago, and what do you think about UFOs and et cetera? We Jews have had to adjust to all kinds of things in history, including Nazi Germany and the difficulties with Israel. I am sure we could adjust to space beings emerging from flying saucers as well. And again, the comments on the survey from Jewish responders were of this character. What about Islam? Our sample was a bit small, but the comments fall in line with what we have seen. Only arrogance and pride would make one think Allah made this vast universe only for us to observe. The black Muslims of America already have UFOs, not just ETI, but UFOs built right into their theology. We are being observed by a mother ship called the Mother Plane. Hinduism, again, our sample wasn't large enough to be scientific, but the comments fit what you've just heard. One Hindu says, "I think such a discovery would make the supernatural claims of religion, particularly from the ancient religious texts of India, more plausible. But it would also somehow make God seem further away." I don't know how to interpret the last phrase, but the first phrase seems to fit what many think of as the ancient astronaut interpretation of scriptures. Now something interesting happens. We did ask for people to self-identify with a religious tradition, which includes the non-religious. Now, what we didn't distinguish, and if I were to do it again, I would distinguish, there is more than one kind of non-religious. One would be an atheist or perhaps an agnostic, and another would be the category of people who say, well, I don't go to church, I don't belong to a religious tradition, but I'm a very spiritual person. We didn't distinguish them, so both of those appear here. And note what happens on questions 3 and 4, where we ask about my beliefs and those of people who are like me. We get basically the same pattern that we saw with the other people who self-identified with a religious tradition. But now the next question tells us a lot. Question 5 reads, "Even though my religious, or in this case my non-religious viewpoint would remain unaffected, contact with extraterrestrials would so undercut traditional beliefs that the world's religions would face a crisis." Now look at the agree and strongly agree. That's 69%. Well, what I find stunning here is that those who believe that religion would face a crisis are the non-believers. The believers think differently about themselves than the non-believers think about them. Now here are some comments from those self-identifying as non-believers. "I remain open-minded, so would not be disturbed by any new findings. I hope we do find life beyond our planet. I have an open mind as to what shape it may take and what influence it will have." Or, "Discovery of ET would not affect my personal belief system because I am a stone atheist. I do search for ET and think we will come across some one day." Finally, and now you can see the nuance here from being spiritual and not religious, "I don't identify with a religious tradition. For those of us who believe in God, whose belief in God is based on experience, extraterrestrial life world would only add an interesting theological factor to our theology." Well, where are we then with regard to what theologians have said and with regard to my Peter's ETI Religious Crisis Survey? If we take a look at this hypothesis, official confirmation of the discovery of a civilization of intelligent beings living on another planet would so undercut traditional religious beliefs that Earth's religious traditions would face a crisis. I want to say it's not confirmed. I would hesitate to make the stronger claim that the hypothesis is disconfirmed, but I think I'd like it to make at least the modest claim that these pieces of evidence do not confirm what seems to be a widely held assumption. First, I'd like to thank everyone who believed in me. Now I would like to move away from religion as an institutional tradition and take a look at the question of the role of science in our culture And I'm going to try to suggest something a bit nuanced, and that is that in a culture that is secular, we still have religious desires, or perhaps better said, spiritual desires and spiritual yearnings. And sometimes these get displaced and come out in scientific language. And if I'm correct in this observation, then we could say as a culture or as a society, religion is not going to go away at all as we think about the impact of extraterrestrial intelligence in our lives, because even people who are not officially religious are very tempted to become religious in a disguised fashion. So in order to look at that, I want to take a look at the field of astrobiology. It's sometimes called exobiology or bioastronomy. And I'm going to look particularly at SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. I know those people fairly well, and they used to like me. They won't after this lecture, but NASA came out with a 3-point astrobiology research agenda, which is pretty well accepted even by the European Space Agency and others who do this kind of research. The first goal is to find the origin of life. Now just pause and remind yourself, from a scientific point of view, we still do not know how prebiotic chemistry becomes living. Secondly, the search for a second genesis of life, either here on Earth or on another planet or celestial body. And then finally, the expansion of life beyond Earth. Chris McKay at NASA is planning on terraforming Mars. We have the Mars Society that wants to establish a colony on Mars, etc. And so that also is included in the research agenda of the astrobiologists. So I'd like to just look at this a little bit more carefully. I'll get to the UFO issue a little bit later, but let's start here with astrobiological science. There is at work what I want to call the ETI myth, in which religion or spirituality is present in scientific language. Now let me pause on the word myth. By the word myth here, I don't mean something that is patently false. No, by myth, I mean a thought structure, a framework, a set of assumptions, a structure of interpretation through which new knowledge or new experience gets interpreted. If you can't think of a better synonym, the myth is the set of assumptions with which we work. Now, if you and I are going to be an astrobiologist or a SETI scientist, what assumptions are we going to make that will motivate us to pursue this research? Well, the first one is big numbers. You heard Story Musgrave last night with the big numbers, and like many of you perhaps, when he showed a little quadrant of the deep field and said, there are 1 trillion galaxies out there. I mean, these numbers are just overwhelming. And so to move from that observation to the logic that says, well, with all those possible worlds out there, there's just got to be people like us. The important point is there is zero empirical evidence, but the big numbers seem to carry rhetorical power. Second is the theory of evolution and the way the theory of evolution is employed. As I mentioned, nobody knows scientifically how life began. And if you read Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species of 1859, which has given us the foundation for our theory of evolution, he says at least 4 times he has no idea how life began. All he can explain is how species come into existence. We're still in the same place today. So if you take the word evolution and you just slip in origin of life, that's sneaky. Secondly, watch how biological evolution absorbs the concept of progress in technology. So that if you say, or as Oprah Winfrey says, I'm evolving every day, Oprah means that she is advancing, that she is progressing. So, but the scientific question is there such a thing as progress within biological evolution or not? Fourth and finally, science is our savior. Science brings us medical advances that lengthen our life. Science brings us all of the good things. And we know what wonderful things science does on Earth. Can you imagine a more advanced science in outer space that would come? What a Christmas event it's going to be when ET shows up. Okay, this is the structure of what I call the ETI myth, and now I'd like to kind of work it out a little bit in scientific thinking. First of all, who gives articulation? Well, Christian de Duve, Nobel Prize winning biologist, holds this view, and he thinks the cosmos is teeming with life. Carl Sagan, of course, one of the co-founders of SETI, Paul Davies, whom we just cited, and then I'll say a little bit more about Frank Drake, the key figure in the development of SETI. Here's Frank, about a year ago. And for the last half century, we've had the Drake equation, and note how it works. By the way, the Milky Way seems to be the crib or the playground within which we're working, simply because other galaxies seem to be too far away. So we start with the Milky Way, and the number of stars, the fraction of stars with planets, the number of planets per star, the fraction of those planets where life evolves. Note, evolve means begin and progress. The fraction where intelligent life evolves, and the fraction of those who are able to build transmitters to communicate with us. And then, because every species is going to have a certain era within which they thrive, will our era here on Earth overlap with theirs? And then finally we end up with the number of communicating civilizations. Carl Sagan estimated 1 million within the Milky Way. George Coyne of the Vatican Observatory thinks it's 10 to the 17th power. Is there any empirical evidence for this? No, none, zero. When I hang around with my SETI colleagues, they say, curiously, we have a science with no data. So the big numbers carry the freight of, oh, yes, it's possible, and it's very inspiring, but we need to distinguish, is this a conclusion or is this an assumption? Okay, Frank was interviewed by a reporter, and now we're getting to the science as savior aspect of the ETI myth. Everything we know says there are other civilizations out there to be found. The discovery of such civilizations would enrich our civilization with valuable information about science, technology, and sociology. This information could directly improve our abilities to conserve and to deal with sociological problems, poverty, for example. Cheap energy is another potential benefit of discovery as our advances in medicine. Now, this is not a carefully thought out scholarly paper. He's just responding in conversation. But note what it is. Science brings good things, and more advanced, more highly evolved science is going to bring even better things. We're going to get better medicine than Obamacare can deliver. Frank is an interesting person. I like him, and I really support the work of SETI, even though I use him as an illustration here. he used to be a UFO investigator, and when I first moved to California some years ago, he and I got on the phone talking, and he was very excited about the same kinds of things that we here in MUFON are excited about. A year ago, the Royal Society in London honored him in respect for 50 years that he'd given to SETI research. And we were drinking a glass of wine, and all these other scientists were running in and out. I said, well, Frank, you used to do so much in UFOs. Do you still have an interest? No, he says, I just kind of drifted away from that. He says, I used to think it was exciting, but now I put my time into SETI. I think it would be kind of fun to actually interview Frank and have him go through this in more detail. Now I want to deal with that component in the ETI myth, the doctrine of progress. If life began on another planet a million years prior to it did on Earth, or a billion years, and if evolution is progressive, leading from the simple to the complex, from the complex to the intelligent, from the intelligent to the scientific and the technological, then we can expect ET to be more advanced than we are. I mean, it just sounds like flawless logic, doesn't it? But it wouldn't hurt to ask an evolutionary biologist if this is what they see in the natural world, and I would like to point to Francisco Ayala, happens to be right here at the University of California at Irvine, one of the world's most respected evolutionary biologists, former president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, a presidential winner for his work, and he says, no way. There is no principle of progress or advance in biological evolution. That your and my appearance on planet Earth as intelligent beings is the result of a long series of chance events in natural selection. And the statistical possibility that this would occur again on another planet, he says, is so small that there is no reasonable way that one would want to anticipate that. So that's what Francisco thinks. He's not alone. There are other major evolutionary biologists who have held this same position that life on Earth is unique. Well, suppose you decided you don't like that point of view. Get me a biologist that believes that evolution is guided. Well, they exist too, Simon Conway Morris or Christian de Duve and others, so you could really get a nice battle going between those two groups. My point here is merely, what are the assumptions, the framework, the myth, so to speak, to which we carry our research? And I would be a little bit trepidatious if I thought a major scientific theorist wouldn't grant me my assumptions. You'll probably hear some remarks from Stan Friedman about SETI, and there's a big difference between SETI and those of us here at MUFON. Stan calls SETI the silly efforts to investigate, and what Stan doesn't like is the assumptions that SETI scientists make, that they're looking for first contact. Whereas, Stan will say, and I think you've heard him say this, we've already had contact. What are you going looking for this for? And hopefully he'll reiterate that tomorrow in his address. So what I'd like to do now is turn from the ETI myth as we see it in SETI and NASA to the distinctive subcategory of how it works in ufology. And there's a lot in ufology that is not connected with the ETI myth, but the ETI myth is a strain. And what we add in the UFO version is contact has already been made, and that belongs in the empirical category. It may be anecdotal, but it's still empirical. And the notion of a government conspiracy. NASA likes government money, so they don't believe in a conspiracy. But it's clear that over the last 6 decades, beginning actually with Donald Kehoe's book in 1950, which is the first book of the UFO genre, right there on page 1, he has a problem with the government conspiracy, and that runs right down to Richard's presentation of a couple minutes ago. But now I want to add a couple more factors. And especially the celestial savior component. Science saves on earth, therefore celestial science will be even better. And I think that a strong influence on the way UFO aficionados think comes from fiction. And it comes from the movie of 1951 called The Day the Earth Stood Still. Do not go see the remake, just the original. And I'd like to ask you how many people have seen this movie, but I can't see you because these lights are in my eyes. Yeah, all right. I like to rewatch this movie every year, at least once. Well, you can remember the plot. We've got the flying saucer landing on the mall in Washington, and the problem has to do with nuclear weapons on Earth, and are we going to destroy ourselves, or what's worse, put one on a rocket and send it up into the celestial spheres and do damage off Earth? Well, Klaatu, who's visiting us from outer space, tries to get a political solution. You know how well it works in Washington today, right? But Klaatu wanted even more than just a Washington decision. He wanted the leaders of all the nations to get together and establish world peace, and it's utterly impossible. They cannot get along. So what does he do? Well, if the politicians won't do it, maybe the scientists will. So he calls a conference of the world's best scientists to meet him at the front porch of his flying saucer, and then the camera shows scientists, from India and China and Africa, all these different races of all people. So it is science that brings the human race together. Politics cannot. Now this is 1951. It's 6 years after the close of the war. Everyone is utterly frustrated with the inability of the United States and the Soviet Union to work something out. And the threat level is so high for a nuclear battle of some kind or another. So at the end, and this is the best part of the movie, Klaatu gives a speech to the scientists. And he stresses the question of peace. And here are just some of his words. There must be security for all, or no one is secure. We live in peace, without arms or armies, free to pursue more profitable enterprises. I'm here to teach you on earth you can do that too. So I actually would call this the Gnostic Redeemer. Klaatu doesn't come and by grace give us world peace, but rather brings the gnosis, the knowledge that tells us how to have world peace. Well, from then on, if you take a look at the doctrines of the various UFO cults and religions that are spawned, almost all of them, for the first couple decades, make nuclear weapons testing and nuclear war a part of their belief system. More recently, It's become ecology. And I'll just mention quickly, this is George Adamski with this Jesus-like figure from Venus is here to help save us from nuclear war. The contemporary group that I find sort of interesting, and I had a master's level student write a thesis on the Raelians. Here's a number of things that are fascinating about this group. Ancient scriptures are reinterpreted in a materialist and atheistic form. So Elohim, which is a Hebrew word for God, now becomes creatures from another planet. And what they bring us is immortality through cloning. Now, cloning is thought of to be a scientific procedure. So Rael says there is no God and obviously no soul. After death, there is nothing unless science is used to create something. The only salvation is through science, and in this case, extraterrestrial science. And among the list of things that we need salvation from, again, is nuclear war. You urgently need to stop nuclear weapons testing, say the spacelings, and if you become a threat to us, we will have to reduce you to silence. In the words of Klaatu, to a burnt-out cinder. So we have Klaatu's speech now here being enunciated by Rael. Here's salvation from ecology. Wasn't this blue back in 1947? So I'm suggesting as my third item of evidence that the idea of religion or spirituality or whatever you want to call it isn't going to go away even if the traditional religions were to remove themselves. Even without traditional religion, the ETI myth creates a secular or scientized religion amongst its believers. So what are my conclusions? Number one, would confirmed evidence of the existence of ETI precipitate a crisis leading to the collapse of the world's religions? My forecast is no, I don't think so. Secondly, should we believe the ETI myth? Well, I want to say no, I don't like believing in myths, but I want to be careful here and say the ETI myth is a good scientific platform to launch a progressive research program. There's no doubt that SETI over the last 50 years has given us lots of knowledge. It didn't answer the question as to whether ET is out there, but they do good science. And it would seem to me that if we recognize that the ETI myth consists more of assumptions than it does conclusions, then it still will give us direction and inspiration for continuing research. Then secretly, and I'll share this secret, I hope the myth is right. I really hope that those ET are out there and they're just as good as Frank Drake or George Adamski hopes they are. Well, thank you for your attention. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to manage question and answer. I've left a little bit of time. And if you don't have a chance to chat about this and you want to, Karen and I have a little vendor's table in the vendor's room. We have some copies of the book I wrote, UFOs, God's Chariots, and maybe you can stop by there at some time later today. So thanks again for your attention, and we'll turn to Q&A. I believe there's a microphone up here. Here comes the man of the hour. Thanks, John.
So for anybody who does have a question, just feel free to come on up. If you can't see me, I'm on the left side of the stage. Come on up.
Professor Ted, thank you very much. The question is, the first two chapters of the book of Job tells us everything.
Did you say the book of Job?
Job, yeah.
Okay.
The first two chapters in which the four key players of the universe in the biblical narratives tell us that this whole planet was based on UFOs and extraterrestrials. Satan is an extraterrestrial. Obviously, he wasn't created out of dust, and he was Lucifer first. And remember the big conference that God called in Job 1, I think 1:6 or something.
Right.
God, the sons of God, who are the created intelligences, who are not made of dust like us, Job obviously representing us, and Satan shows up. And then everything acts out. It's so obvious.
Okay, I'd like to have you introduce yourself. Dr. Roy, just tell us who you are. And your name is Dr. Roy. You don't need to do that.
I came to America in 1964 to study 4 forms of Americanized religion. Coming from a Hindu background, I was very curious to see what America had to offer new. And I discovered that imported religion, which came with the immigrants, was subordinated by the American spirit that we'll create our own religion. So 4 religions were birthed right here in the United States, and I studied those 4. And coming from India, I found the parallel that India also had 4 religions that were birthed in India. So being a very patriotic new American, I said, no religion made in China is acceptable. Anyway, that's my background.
Yeah, to your question, I'm trying to understand it. First, it's unusual that one would go to the book of Job for a creation account. Then secondly, as the book of Job is opening and we're setting up this adversary, remember the word for Satan there is actually adversary, vis-a-vis God, it's setting it up now for the temptation problems that Job is going to confront. So I'm trying to understand your interpretation. Are you saying that Satan has created an intelligent race that's pre-human in character, which is fallen? I'm trying to understand the question.
The question, the origins of that book of Job, is directly linked for the first 2 chapters of Genesis, in which the tree of knowledge of good and evil was planted even before humans were created. Now, strictly on the biblical narratives, I don't know if it's happened or not, but as a sociologist, you tell me your story and I accept your story. You know, truth will be put in place eventually. But it's strictly, if you say religion, what religion?
Well, there are some legends in both Jewish and Christian early literature about a fall before the fall. That is to say, Satan is expelled from heaven, or Lucifer is expelled from heaven, and then earth and its inhabitants are sort of coming out of the exhaust pipe. You see this also in some of the Platonic and Neoplatonic literature, in which the demiurge sort of plays the role that the devil does in this literature. When you read Genesis 2 and 3, just straight, you don't see that. Adam and Eve are blessed, originally blessed with life in this creation, and it's their action within the creation that precipitates what we call the fall. They weren't destined, by Satan in advance to do that. So I would hesitate to pit Job against Genesis, but I can't really read Genesis the way you describe it, even though Job, let me just say, I wouldn't put Job on the same status as I would Genesis.
This issue of final resolution of good and evil. We want the extraterrestrials to bring us peace, and like you said, it's the knowledge that is imparted.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Well, just one more, you can sit down. One more comment about that. There are those, both within Jewish and Christian tradition and also outside of it, who would add that Lucifer actually hoped that the human race would rise. And so the temptation to sin gave us the knowledge of good and evil we would not have had if we'd have been in that blind innocence. So this is called the fall upward. You can see it in the philosopher Hegel or something like that. So the theological question is, should that kind of knowledge be so costly? That's a theological question. All right, Fred, tell us who you are.
My name is Frederick Fox. I'm a retired Navy pilot and captain with American Airlines. I've had a very interesting close encounter of a second kind, which is documented in Dr. Greer's disclosure book. I find your analysis of ETs and religion very enlightening, and yet I question why we are not given the privilege of experiencing all these benefits from contact with extraterrestrial lives. And as I espoused or hypothesized to the panel yesterday, with reference to the Book of Urantia on page 46, which some of you may be familiar with, they allude to the fact that Earth is the penal colony of the galaxy, where the finest criminal minds are incarcerated. Now, you just mentioned that Lucifer was cast out of heaven into the pit, which is the third dimensional planet that we know as Earth. And therefore, he is incarcerated here metaphorically because he has violated the laws of the universe to be, as Klaatu said, to pursue more profitable efforts than war. And you only have to look to all the TV programs today on television. It's crime scene this, crime scene that, Law and Order Special Victims Unit, NCIS, ad infinitum, ad nauseum. The inmates are doing a show and tell, okay? Now, as long as they want to fight along among themselves, and as Buddhism teaches, they can't get off the wheel of 84, they're going to stay here until they learn their lessons. But there is a greater intelligence out there in the universe that has learned their lessons, and this is what Buddhism teaches. So my question is, we haven't been allowed to have all this benefits of contact with extraterrestrial intelligence because we're in jail. And until we grow up and learn our ways and pay our karmic debts for violating universal law, we're not going to have those contacts and benefits, even though they're available at some point in time.
The idea that our planet is a penal colony suggests that it's only a negative judgment about human nature. I think it'd be a little bit more accurate to say that the situation is ambiguous. Yes, it's true that every generation that I've been alive, we've had one war after another, and it's going to be true for my grandchildren as well. War is not going away. But at the same time, we don't like it. We protest against it. We look for ways to make peace. And if I may quote Stan Friedman again, he'll have to defend himself tomorrow. Yesterday at the press conference, Stan said something similar. He said, "We are a warlike people on earth. Just think, if we could take the money we spend on weapons and feed starving children in the poorer parts of the world, wouldn't that be better?" Now, what I want to say is, it's ambiguous. There is a heart here that says our moral responsibility is to feed starving children, yet we're in war. I want to say it's an ambiguous situation in which this desire to do good is as much a part of the human situation as being victims of war. I want to say the same thing about science. Yes, science saves, but in 1947, the designer of the atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan, Robert Oppenheimer, could foresee the future of the Cold War, and he asked that there be an international organization that would take total supervisory command of all nuclear weapons in order to prevent them from ever being dropped again. Well, Harry Truman wouldn't buy that, and neither would Joseph Stalin, and so we ended up with more than half a century of Cold War. So I picked on Oppenheimer because he designed the bomb that was dropped, and at the same time there was a part of him that said, I want peace. I don't want to run around killing people. So I think that science is one of those things that it can go either way. Science can be salvific, and if you've ever had emergency surgery and lived through it, you say, thank God for science. At the same time, our power to destroy has been enhanced. So I would want to say to the Urantia book, yeah, we may be prisoners, but we're not all that bad.
As Richard Dolan said in the previous speech, everything that comes in scientific that could benefit us ends up in military black projects used to perpetuate war. It never gets down in the public for peaceful uses, which is the message right out of The Day the Earth Stood Still. Now, for those of you that are Star Trek fans, there have been any number of episodes. One that comes to light was Whom Gods Destroy. Another one dealing with the penal colony of the galaxy. Another one in Star Trek Next Generation series, Who's Watching the Watchers? And another xenophobic race that could not accept the fact that there was more intelligent life out there. Those of you who have seen that know what has been presented, and it's food for thought.
Thank you, Fred.
My name is Sam Polk. I'm a retired lawyer, a municipal lawyer living in Santa Monica. I was intrigued by the Vatican's council about the need for salvation of the aliens, called by the Pope back in the early 90s, wasn't it? You remember that conference?
No, I don't. Just remind all of us. The Pope. Go ahead. I don't know what you're talking about.
I read that the Pope called a conference for the Vatican, for the cardinals, to consider the question of whether we should try to save the aliens by persuading them to accept Jesus as their savior.
Right.
I wonder if the same thing has been discussed in other religious groups.
The question, as I understand it, coming from the Vatican in the 1990s was, should we send missionaries to ET and convert them to Jesus Christ as the one and only Lord and Savior? Let me just provide a little background. That in the theological discussions which I was reporting, even centuries ago, the question amongst Christian theologians, especially Catholic theologians, was, does God's saving work in the historical Jesus Christ on earth count only for earth, or does it count for beings in other worlds? And they lined up on both sides. Paul Tillich, who's the Protestant that I quoted, he lines up on the side of many incarnations, one for each civilization. Paul Davies, whom I also cited, says, oh, that's ludicrous. I mean, how could God run around from planet to planet doing God's saving work? Now, I don't know precisely what the Pope might have said. That would be John Paul II in the 1990s on that particular issue. The Jesuits at the Vatican Observatory certainly discuss this ad nauseum, and they even get tired of talking about it, you know. Perhaps coming out of this because of it being in the wind is the science fiction novel, The Sparrow. And I'm trying to remember the author's name, a woman in the East Coast. At any rate, it's sort of a denunciation of this kind of missionary zeal on the part of the Jesuits. So does this speak to it without answering it specifically?
Sure.
All right, good.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, one more, go ahead.
Purely speculative question, but assuming...
I like speculation.
There you go.
Yeah.
Assuming the ETI myth is not a myth, and in fact, in actuality, let's say an ETI presence does exist.
Maybe it's a myth today, truth tomorrow.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Would you see, with full disclosure, the possibility of a formation of a new religion or new world religion outside of our
Or
convention?
would I see, in the event that we do have contact, that there might be the formation of a new religion which may or may not reject the old ones?
Or some kind of hybridization?
Or a hybridization? Well, at the end of my presentation, I showed you the little eticon, ET plus icon, which suggests that that's exactly what would happen. Paul Davies speculates. He actually is more nuanced than I made him look here in my lecture. He speculates, suppose ET is more advanced than we are in matters of spirituality. And suppose you and I sit at the feet of the ET teachers and we learn things that really broaden our horizon and deepen our sensitivities. Will we be inclined to convert? That is his argument. I would have to say that's a reasonable hypothesis. It's not unreasonable to follow that kind of logic. So basically my response is let's wait and see. I would hesitate to land too hard on the judgment before it actually happens. What do you think? You got an opinion?
My opinion would be, yes, there's the potential of and maybe formed from people that in essence weren't religious, maybe coming more from the non-religious sector into a different kind of spiritual or some kind of enlightened religion that looked at God as more of a universal consciousness. Mm-hmm. So I maybe. Once again, it's just speculation.
Right.
So
it's speculation, but I think in a place like this, we ought to be able to speculate with liberty. One more quick one. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I cannot see, sir, why you posed the question, should we believe the ETI myth? I question the word myth when there are so many books with excellent, valid photographs of UFOs, and where there have been absolute abductions studied by Dr. John Mack, and where entities have been seen to come out to test the soil and the water on this earth, why you use that word myth in the light of that?
I think you misinterpreted me.
Why?
The Paul Trent photograph, I wouldn't call that myth. Witnesses who claim that beings get out of a visiting craft and pick up soil samples and take them back. These are reports. My word myth doesn't refer to those reports. It refers to the framework of interpretation. And I actually had an evening with John Mack and his researchers at Harvard some years ago when he was still alive. And I talked to him about this very subject matter, and I said, John, I have to tell you that your abduction reports don't fit the myth as I understand it. And I said that most UFO contactees and abductees prior to the late 80s had positive experiences when they were abducted. And I said, most of your abductees report these negative experiences. So we talked it through. And he said, yeah, Dr. Peters, I kind of enjoy what you're saying, and he says, I need to tell you that some of the people he had reported on in the book who had negative experiences were coming around and telling him they've become positive experiences. That is to say, they feel that it was a moment of enlightenment. So I use the word myth as the framework for interpretation, not the actual encounter or the report of the encounter.
Others' interpretation, is that correct? You mean others' interpretation?
Yes and no. As I suggested, that if you take a look at the claims of the cult leaders, or if you take a look at early reports by a person who's had an abduction experience, and then you watch as that person sort of teases out the meaning of that, then I think you'll see this framework of interpretation coming to work. I see you're skeptical. Is it because of the word myth?
Yes.
And okay, well, remember I wanted to say I don't see myth as something false. I see myth as a structure of interpretation through which we filter these anomalous events.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you.